Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am Harry Lasaniziris, and this is my YouTube channel, grecochess. We're continuing the coverage of the online grecochess tournament taking place in chess.com. Three more games have completed since the last time we presented some games. And now we're going to show you these three games. And what we'll try to make sure is that there's going to be no spoilers alert, as I say, meaning in the previous videos, inadvertently, we were showing the next moves and the results of the games at some points, and we'll try to avoid it. Let's see if we can do it to keep the surprise and the excitement. And let's start with our first game. And the first game is U86-30302 versus Butterfly. There is a rating difference about 100. Butterfly is a little bit better, but this is not decisive. Yes, the odds are better for Butterfly, but that's all that is. And let's see what happened with the game. White starts with the D pawn, and Black replies with the knight going to f6. White sends a bishop to g5. Not very common, but this is in the book. This is what's called the Trompowsky attack. A bishop on g5 and attacks the knight on f6. Black sends a pawn to g6 in order to facilitate the development of the bishop on f8, send it to g7 to fianchetto it, I'm sorry. Quick change now. Uh, Black is double pawns on the f files, and the king on e8 is a little exposed. Two sides continue the developments, and at this point, until now, until the fourth move, both sides were following book. Now the fifth move, the bishop to c4, is not the best. You're going to see the computer shows the best move with the green arrow. According to the computer, the best move for white would have been for the pawn to go from c2 to c4. And black has a small advantage, 0.26. Castles for black, develop for knights. They are not necessarily the best moves, but they're quite okay moves. You see the green arrows after every move, what move the computer thinks would have been the best. Until now, black has a very small advantage. And now the advantage goes back to white after the pawn went to c5. White has an advantage of 0.11, which they keep it by taking the pawn and having an extra pawn. Knight to a3, not a good move, says the computer, because you don't want your knight to be on the edge. The computer would rather have the knight on d2. Black opens the long diagonal where they have fianchettoed their dark-colored bishop. Knight to b5, good idea for white, and threatens with the fork knight on e7 if black doesn't do something about it. Not yet, because there's a queen on e7. So the knight cannot go. Black tries to kick out the knight from b5, but the queen on a4 makes sure the knight can stay, because if black takes the knight, then the white queen will take the rook on a8. And now the fork is possible. The queen stopped protecting the c7 square, so the knight can go there, and it does. It's a great move, says the computer. You see the exclamation mark, and attacks the two rooks. And black can only save one of them. They try, but the advantage of white has reached 2.20 and stays 2.20 after they grab one of the two black rooks. And they want to make sure that the remaining rook stays on a8 in the corner of the board instead of the central e file. And the advantage of white becomes 2.61. They are fighting along the a file. If all goes okay, they might be able to win the a pawn. Black tries to stop it by placing the knight on a5. You see the orange mark means not a very good move. It's not a mistake, but inaccuracy. It's an inaccuracy when you see this orange mark with the exclamation, with the question exclamation mark. White's advantage becomes 3.60. And white places the two rooks on the a file. and is attacking the pawn on a6. Black will move it to a5 to save it for the time being. White continues the attack with a b4 of sending the pawn to b4. Clearly black cannot take it because they lose the rook on a8. But if they ignore it, pawn will take on a5 and will continue towards promotion perhaps. Queen goes to c6 because black must save the queen first of all. And after the exchanges, white finally wins the pawn on a5. The b pawn is a passed pawn, protected by the pawn on c3. So white has an important advantage. 3.56 is a computer, and white is towards winning the game if everything goes according to plan. Rooks are exchanged, 351 for white. Black tries to attack the pawn on b5. White takes a bishop on e6. Black takes back with a pawn, not the best way. And white's advantage is 4.51. And the odds are overwhelming, favoring white. White is near victory, but let's see what's going to happen. And look at that. In one move, everything changes dramatically. From 4.51 for white, you see the m1 here. Black can make in one move. Will they see it? For one that is watching the game, I think it's quite obvious there is a background problem for white, and queen can go to d1, but will black see it? Because on the chessboard, things are not so simple as they look when you're just watching from your computer screen other people's games. But black saw it, and believe it or not, black unexpectedly won the game, which proves that no matter how much ahead you are, you must be vigilant until the very end. But let's see now the computer evaluation. What does the computer have to say about this game? We need to change the screen to cover the review part of the game. Computer thinks that white had 84.9 accuracy versus 83.3 for black. White played as if the rating was 1750, while black as if it was 1700. In the various categories, white is doing better in most of them. 1 great versus 0 for black, 8 best versus 5, 7 versus 6 excellent, good, 4 for white, 9 for black, 4 bookmarks each of them, 2 inaccuracies each of them. Black made a mistake, but the one category that matters, the blunder, the last move, white blundered and lost again. This concludes the coverage of the first game. And let's go now to the second game. The second game is from group number 4. My Skin with the White, rating 1452, and Scrapido for Black, rating 941. Group 4 is where 2 out of the 4 players either timed out or resigned early, so the 2 remaining will fight for the one position that will send them to the final. My Skin is Scrapido, and as you understand that whoever does better than the other, meaning whoever gets at least 1.5 out of 2 in their 2 games, advances. If each of them gets 1 point, they both advance. But let's see what's going to happen. My Skin is the favorite. 500 points difference is quite significant, but let's see what happened on the chessboard. Till now, Book field of defense is called when the pawn goes to d6. By the way, just to tell you, this is not ideal under excellent play, meaning for the very top players with ratings above 2000, clearly. White has an important advantage, but at our level and the level of these two players, that doesn't mean too much. The reason is because the bishop on f8 is blocked. And white starts losing some advantage. Pawn to h3, not a good move. The computer would want the pawn to go to d4. That's what happens in the fill it defense. White should send a pawn on d4 and exchange on d4. But still, white has a small advantage, 0.25, because it started first. Knight f6 attacks the pawn on e4, defended by the knight on c3. White sends a pawn to d4. You want to have pawns in the center, at least in the beginning. Mistake, says black. When you see the orange with a question mark and no exclamation, this means mistake. If it's a question mark and exclamation, this is inaccuracy. White's advantage becomes now 1.98. It's important. Castling, okay move. You see, when you have this thumbs up, it means it's an excellent move. Not the best. The best is always indicated by this arrow. When you see the star like here, that means that the move is the best. White is 1.84 ahead. Good move, knight. White sends the knight to a5, attacking the pawn on g7. Black sends a king to f8. The computer would rather have black castle. White's advantage is 2.56. But don't forget what happened in the previous game. 4.51 advantage changed dramatically in just one move. Continue now, little by little. We are near the end of the opening, going towards the middle game. Inaccuracy says the computer doesn't like the knight to take on e7, would rather have the bishop go back to f1. Black can either take the knight with the king, queen or king, or take the bishop on c4. Let's see what black will do. Mistake! Would rather have black take the bishop because the knight on e7 is not that safe. Well, the bishop on c4 can easily go to safety now. And the advantage of white becomes 4.08. And this is a brilliant move for white. Why is it brilliant? Because white disregards the bishop. Of course, black cannot take the bishop because then they lose their queen on e7. And yes, what happened is that, let's go back where we were. What are black's choices? If they keep the knight on e5, they lost it. If they take the bishop on c4, they lose the queen. But they decided to do something even worse. They lose the queen without even taking the knight. At least take the knight, because you'll have then, you'll take rook and at least take, I'm sorry, take the bishop, because then you have rook and the bishop for the queen. Still, a queen is better than the two of them, but not the difference is not so big like now that the white will take a queen for the rook. And white's advantage becomes 4.97. Let's see how things will continue. Bishop to t2. Yes, ideally you want your bishop on c3, either to exchange the knight or attack the pawn on g7. White needs now to start exchanging pieces to guarantee their win. As I have mentioned, when you are ahead, you want exchanges. White more or less tries to attack. Let's see if rooks will be exchanged. White wants to exchange rooks, black does not want. Till now, when you see this green exclamation mark, this means good move. Hence, thumbs up is excellent and the star is the best. That is how we can know what the computer thinks about the move. Like this time, like for white, it means that this was their best move. The advantage is 5.92. And now it is mate in 6. Computer says that white gets mate in 6. Let's see how. Maybe if I was white, without knowing what the computer thinks, I would put my queen on c6 and check and minimize the where black can go. In fact, black can only send their king on d8 and continue from there. Let's see if this is the best move. Yes, mate in 5 moves. And king goes to d8. This arrow that you see here, this arrow to the right, means that this was the only move for white. If the knight on f6 did not exist, rook would go to f8 and mate, but this is not the case. If white would make the mistake and put the rook on e8, they would lose a lot because the rook would be taken. Now, there's a pin. So the white queen can take on d6 with a check, and the queen cannot be taken back because of the pin. then what would happen is that knight would go to d7. Would that lead to mate or not? Let's see, it's not easy to see how to continue because the queen can go neither to ef or f8 because of the other knight. Let's see how the game will continue. A fine move, not the best as a computer. What the computer would want is the pawn go to 5, attack the knight on g6, and then really with this knight not covering the f e7 squares, white could check from d6 and then from e7. So white from m from the, guaranteed mate has 6.54 advantage, but black result. In any case, the situation is very hopeless. And this concludes the game. Now let's see, what does the computer think about this game, my skin versus Scrapido. This means that if my skin can get a draw against Scrapido in the second game, my skin advances alone. If Scrapido with white wins the second game, then both of them advance. But let's see what is the computer review, the analysis in the various categories. And here we're going to see what does the computer think. 79.2 percentage for white versus 66.2 for black. And white played as if their rating was 1500, while black as if it was 1100. Let's see how they did in the various categories. White had one brilliant move, and it was when they sent the pawn to f4. After that, the game, even that, before that, white was ahead, but now the game was almost over. White had 7 best versus 4 for black, 6 excellent versus 5, 6 good moves each of them, 2 book moves. And white had 2 inaccuracies versus 3 for black, no mistakes for white, no misses, no blunders, and 2 mistakes for black. And this concludes the coverage of the second game. And we continue now with the third and last game. And later on, we'll see how things are going the 4 groups. And this is the third game. It is butterfly. Now butterfly has a white pieces versus U863032. Butterfly had an unexpected win out of a completely lost position. The rating difference are now smaller. You may wonder why the ratings they have now are not the same they had last time. Uh, this is because between these two games, they may have played other games that affected their ratings. So the rating difference is quite smaller now. Butterfly is less than 100 points ahead of U86. But let's see what actually happened. They both start with the e-pawns, book theory. Knight to f3, queen to f6 for black. It's not good to move your queen early in the game. Why? First of all, the opponent will try to attack it. And if you're not careful or unlucky, you might even lose your queen. But even if you do everything right and you save your queen, your opponent develops while all you do is moving your king right and left. And so the other side will start with a better middle game. 123 is advantage for white. Bishop to c4. The best move for the computer is knight to c3, threatening to go to d5 and attack the queen. Black will defend with pawn to c6, but you see that white acts and black reacts. White will develop another piece, while all black is doing is moving pawns to defend the queen. Pawn to c5 for black, best move. White castles. Black sends pawn to c6. Computer thinks a mistake, and white has advantage of 2.86. The computer says the best option, meaning for black, was to develop a knight and attack the center. How can white take advantage of that? I think if you move the pawn to d3, for example, and then the bishop to g5, you create an advantage for white because you're chasing the queen. For the time being, the queen has somewhere to go, for example, to d6. But white develops and black just moves the king around, excuse me, the queen around. Pawn to c3, inaccuracy. White would want first to move the pawn to c3 and then the pawn to d4. The computer wants directly the pawn to go to d4. Knight to e7. The computer would also want for black to move the d pawn. 288 advantage for white. Pawn goes to d4. And now the bishop is attacked on c5. Black needs to move the bishop somewhere. Sends back to b6, inaccuracy. 3.93 advantage for white. Knight to c3 for white. Pawn to h6 for black. Mistakes is the computer, but white still has an advantage, smaller than before, 1.56. Computer wants white to expand his space, send pawn to e5, attack the black queen. Of course, the queen is not going to get lost, but it is going to soon out of squares, can only go to g6 and f5. Let's see. Pawn to d6 for black. Rook to e1 for white. Of course, they wanted to be faced on the opposite king. Queen to g6. Inaccuracy. Knight to h4 attacks the black queen. Queen to f6. Mistake. When it attacks the knight on h4, white gets advantage of 3.78. Great move for white. The pawn goes to g3, of course, defends the black knight. Knight to g6 for black, and attacks the white knight. Computer says that this loses a queen. Let's see how. If pawn goes to e5, black can take it back. Yes, then white will take it back with a pawn on d4. And if the queen takes back, then the bishop goes to b6 and the queen is pinned. But how else can the queen go to lost? Clearly, the bishop cannot go to g5. The knight, well, if the knight goes to d5, the queen is in danger, and if the pawn takes it, then the white pawn takes, and let's see how the queen would get lost. And will white see it? But the computer gives 5.04 advantage for white. It's not obvious how the queen will get lost. Yes, the computer wants white to push the pawn to e5. Now, by exchanging the knights, white is still ahead, but the 5.04 before, you see the 5.0 here, it shows a little bit less accurate what is white's advantage. 5.04 becomes suddenly 1.60. Black takes it. Queen to d2 for white, 112 the advantage is inaccuracy. Queen to f6 for black. The computer would rather have black castle. Now white's advantage is 2.18. Pawn to d5. This misses a better way to create a pawn chain. Bishop to h3 for black. Well, this is what they call a desperation move, meaning if black would play twice more in a row, queen to f3 and g2 is made. But of course, white is not going to let it, or will it? Bishop goes to, takes the bishop on h6. Clearly, white doesn't feel comfortable. The bishop on b6 being the same diagonal of the king on g1. That is why it's an excellent move. And black sends their queen to f3 and they threaten a mate in one. The computer says that the best option was to recapture a piece, recapture the bishop, and gives white an advantage of 2.37. Bishop goes to f1 to defend against a mate. I think that was the only move they had. It's a great move. Black takes a bishop, white exchanges, and black takes the bishop on b6. At this point, white saved the game, unlike the previous game where um, Butterfly was able to take advantage of it, making one opportunity. Now Butterfly would not give his opponent this opportunity. White is ahead by 2.37. But let's see how the game continues. Rook to e1. Well, white wants to develop the rook and not only develop, but have it opposite the white king. If the e4 pawn would disappear, then there would be a check and direct line for the king. But white finally castles. Black finally castles, I'm sorry. 135 advance for white. Rook to f3, attack the queen. Queen goes to h5. Pawn to a3 for white. Perhaps wants to start moving the pawns along the a5. Mistakes the computer with 0.43 advantage for black. And black, instead of developing the knight, pushes the b pawn to b5. Now the game is more or less equal. Before it was 0.21 only for white, meaning almost equal. Now it increases a little bit more to 0.66. The problem for white is they cannot take the pawn on b4, otherwise they lose the rook, and their knight is attacked. So of course they save the knight to b7, not to b7, to b5, threaten perhaps to take the pawn on d6 or place it on c7. And white takes a pawn on d6, and the up by is 1.27. Knight goes to f6 inaccuracy. Pawn to f3, the best move for white. Now, with the pawn move, white has once again important advantage, 2.61. The knight attacks the pawn saves itself, white attacks again. And the rook attacks the pawn on c5. Inaccuracy. The computer, white's advantage is 0.76. Exchange the pawns. Of course, white does not want the a pawn, black c pawn to be near promotion. Continue now. White is always ahead, but not by too much. Now, after the queen to e2, that is a miss. The X mark that you see here in a red circle means a miss. The queen could go to c3 and attack both the knight and the pawn on c5. Pawn to g4 attacks the black queen. Queen goes to g5. Rook goes to c3, attacks and of course protects itself, because otherwise it was attacked twice by the knight and the queen and defended only by the queen. Black wins the a pawn. And this is a blunder. Computer says that this gives a free rook to black. Let's see what's happening. Of course, the knight on c4 can take the rook on a3, but this is just an exchange of rooks. And we also have the other story. The queen on g5 can attack the rook on c1. It's not protected by that rook anymore. And with a check. So after the check, black can win this rook and then we win this rook. But is black going to see it? Let's give a look. But now, for the first time, I think from the beginning, black has an advantage of 3.75. Until now, white was ahead, even though at sometimes by a very small margin. Let's see if black will take advantage of this opportunity. Yes, he takes the rook. And they take the other rook with a knight, although the computer would rather have them take it by the queen. So the advantage from 375 becomes 3.36. But you see here the white flag in the red circle means that white resigned. And once again, let's give a look at what is the review of the overall review of the computer. Accuracy 64.6 for butterfly and 69.0 for U86. Rating, oh yeah, their ratings were very low. Both of them had ratings below 1,000. 750 for white, 900 for black, way below the abilities. But let's see in the categories, the middle. You're going to see that white had two great moves. Best 10 for white, 11 for black, 5 excellent for white, 2 for black, 2 for white, 4 for black. Book moves 2 for white, 1 for black. Inaccuracy 6 for white, 14 for blacks. Mistakes 5 for white, 4 for black. Misses 3 for white, and blunders 1 for white. Once again, the game between the two of them was decided in a blunder, which means that no matter how much ahead you are, you better be very, very careful. This concludes the coverage of the three games. And let's see how is the overall score in this tournament in the four groups. Here we are. Group 1. Maxim Govorukha has 2 wins in 2 games. Butterfly has 1 win and 1 loss. U863032 has 1 win and 3 losses, while Hunting Achievements have not yet completed any of the games. Group 2. Barak 7 has 3 wins in 3 games. MGC 89 has 2 wins. But what's happening is Andrea Marta has withdrawn from the tournament, has closed the account. That is why Barak 7 and MGC 89 got some extra wins, while Boris Alexandrovich Peasants lost the games before Andrea Marta withdrew or closed the account. So Boris started with 2 losses. This means that for Boris, it's almost impossible to catch up. Boris would have to win all 3 games, and even if they won all 3 games, then at least one of the barracks of MGC 89 would have more than 3 points. So in the group 2, it is between Barak 7 and MGC 89. They still have not completed the games between them. Group 3 is where I participate. No game has been completed. And Group 4, what's happening? With 2 players having timeouts and early resignations, the whole thing will be decided by My Skin versus Crapido. My Skin has won the first game, and everything will be decided on what happens in the other game. If Crapido wins, then both advance, otherwise My Skin advances. And until now, we have completed 22 of the 48 games in the first round, the qualifying round, meaning we're almost near the middle, but some games finished quite fast. We'll continue the coverage as games go on. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for watching, thanks for viewing, thanks to the subscribers. And if you have not subscribed yet, all it takes is click the subscribe button. Thanks for some nice comments I have received. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Harry Lasaniziris. This is my grecochess YouTube channel. Goodbye.